I'm really pleased this week at the SETI seminar to introduce Professor David Shorter. Professor Shorter did his undergraduate work at Arizona State University, where he did a BA and MA in religious studies with a minor in women's studies. His PhD is from UC Santa Cruz in the history of consciousness. He did a postdoc at Wesleyan and was an assistant professor at Indiana in folklore and ethnomusicology before moving to UCLA in 2008, where today he is a professor in world arts and cultures and dance with a joint appointment in gender studies with affiliations with American Indian Studies, Center for Digital Humanities, the Center for Mexican Studies, Center for Study of Religion, and the Latin American Institute. And he is the director of the Archive of Healing. He had a 2009 book, We Will Dance Our Truth, which has won awards, including the Chicago Folklore Prize for Best Book. How he got onto our radar is that he co-edited a special issue of the American Indian Culture and Research Journal on SETI and contributed an introduction and an article in that. And regulars to our journal club will remember that Macy led a journal club on the issue several months ago, and we had a really neat discussion, after which we decided that we would love to have Professor Shorter come and talk to us directly about the material. So I hope you've all had a chance to look at that stuff. We sent it around with the talk abstract. And with that, I will pass the torch off to Professor Shorter.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Jason, to Macy, to everyone who is, I was going to say made it out today, but I guess I mean made it to your camera today. I wouldn't be able to have done this work if it wasn't for some deep conversations with one of my graduate advisors, Donna Haraway. And as Jason knows, there was a certain moment in this writing process where I realized I just couldn't make the claims that I was making without knowing SETI much deeper than I did. And so I really thank Catherine Denning for looking over some pages that I was sort of, you might want to say I didn't give her the whole article, but I really needed her to look over the SETI parts. And I was really amazed in that process because I was making some pretty, I thought, audacious claims for someone who doesn't know an organization very well. And it's always very easy to critique from the periphery, right? So I was sort of making these fairly broad claims about SETI, though that's not what she actually had a problem with. She sort of came back and saying like, yep, that's right. And so I found myself in sort of in a scary situation, which I'm going to be really upfront about today, is that one of my pedagogical approaches, particularly as an ethnographer, is that I go places, I sort of see what's taking place, and then I extrapolate into some theory about the behavior that I'm noticing. So instead of starting with my piece on the frontier of redefining intelligent life, which I do want to get to, I'm actually going to start with the introduction, because I think introduction of the journal and introduction of this presentation go hand in hand, because they do give you a little backstory about probably people and organizations you know much better than I do. But it started in 2018 when I had an invitation to join the Native American or Native Studies Working Group to Breakthrough Listen. And I'm sure everyone in this room knows more about Breakthrough Listen than I do, but that's where the story starts. Now, why me? I am a settler. I'm a non-native person who's written extensively about the Native women in my family and why I don't claim it, and issues of racial shifting and privilege, that sort of thing. And then I have a PhD that looks at the history of science. And then, as I insinuated inside my article, my father worked on UFO projects for the US government for my entire childhood in the deserts of New Mexico. So as you can imagine, I've been in conversations about UFOs, extraterrestrials, unidentified aerial phenomena, however you want to call them, for quite a long time. And as an ethnographer, I've paid really close attention to claims made by people who are interested in UFOs and ETs and aliens. And I started to really see a distinction inside not only just popular culture, but the literature about how those people were talked about as being, crazy or not grounded in science, which is a very parallel conversation, you might want to say, to my work in the world of healing and what counts as old age, like things like chakras and channels, and new age, how those two things come around. So I was very interested when the call came in 2018, would I like to join some other Native Studies scholars to talk with this group called Breakthrough Listen. And the way that it was conveyed to me was Breakthrough Listen was a subset of SETI. So to someone like me who grew up with a father who was an engineer in the deserts of New Mexico working on UFO stuff, I had kind of hit the big time. What? SETI? Like David Shorter is going to work in some component of having to do with SETI? This was very interesting to me. My father was in the process of dying. There was probably some emotional stuff caught up in there, and that like, oh, he'd be so proud of me that I've sort of broke through myself as a scholar. Real scientists might have to listen to me rather than just people in the humanities. So I was very excited, and Kim Tallbear's a great friend. We go back a long way. So we did decide to go ahead and do this. And we worked with Sonia Atley, who's Anishinaabe, who really focuses on research ethics. And we joined Dr. Willie Limper from Bowdoin College. And we went to the table with the sort of very clear understanding that our task was fairly simple, which is that as people who work in Native studies, what would we offer Breakthrough Listen from a disciplinary perspective? And we really, you might want to say, knew SETI different ways. I probably would knew them the most because I'd been teaching classes on aliens and extraterrestrial contact for, by that point, 13 or 14 years. Whereas Sonia Atley, Kim Tallbear, they were kind of new to it. They're Native scholars who do most of their stuff in Native studies. Then they were very interested in, of course, the advancement of Native studies as a profession. So they were in it probably for that motivation. And we took a look at SETI's history, and we took a look at all the documents that Breakthrough Listen sent us, and we took a look at Breakthrough Listen's website. And we wrote a very, you might want to say, extensive working group statement, and it came to about 13 pages. And then one of the people who invited us, Claire, essentially wrote back and said, oh, this is amazing, but you have about 3 pages, not 10 to 13. So that was, you know, as you can imagine, for people who are loquacious and babble a lot, that was hard for us because we did actually see there were a wide range of critiques. And that was the first inclination we had, that we had something here more than a working group statement. We possibly had a journal's worth. We had a collection of perspectives and issues that came up for us. But if you tell a bunch of scholars that you have 3 pages to do something, then you all know very well in this room that you can do very little. So you might as well just take a very little thing as you might want to say case study. And what we worked on and honed in on is the wording. Wording that everyone in this room would know very well is problematic, probably in ways better than I. But what we had seen is a sort of duplication, not just on Breakthrough Listen's self-representation, but across SETI websites, self-representation, SETI talks, things that you might want to say in a class in college with freshmen, we spend weeks on. And you know, you might want to say, well, that's just college. You spend a lot of time focusing on little minute things. But particularly, we use the word science and intelligence and advanced civilizations and technology, all with scare quotes in the classes that I teach, because they're all very weighty in the study of the history of colonialism. For a lot of Native studies, these terms are actually painful. And we, you might want to say, saw right away that there was a agility with these terms in SETI's representation and Breakthrough Listen's representation, which kind of maybe evidence that they hadn't really thought of the history of colonialism on this planet close enough. And I allude to this in the essay on the frontiers of redefining intelligent life, but it was very interesting to me when there were all these disruptions on college campuses having to do with boycott movements and social justice and stuff. There was this one thing that administrators tend to sort of say, which is that we just hope for civility. We just hope that there's some sort of sense of civility. Well, that word is one of those words like you could all agree, everyone in the room would be like, yeah, that's right. Civility is a good thing. Actually, in a Native studies context, that's not a civility brings to mind civilizational theories. And the idea is that there are civilized tribes, which are actually much more like US political formations. That's what counts as civilized. So that's just an example. Just by analogy, I wanted to say that there's this term that sometimes you can think are completely neutral, and they're not neutral at all within a particular lens. And so science, advanced civilization, intelligence, technology, those were not just on Breakthrough Listen, they were on SETI sites. And SETI self-representations. And that's, you might want to say, when I started doing deep reading. That's when I actually started going and looking at, you might want to say, one of the, if we could just use this, gendered word, founding father, just started looking at what Carl Sagan had written, because I hadn't actually read Carl Sagan's work. I mean, I knew who Carl Sagan was. I was born in the 1970s. So Carl Sagan was sort of the guy on TV talking about space more than anyone else. And that's why in my article, I talk about, I sort of feel like I grew up with that SETI. My father was invested in doing engineering work. He saw himself as being in a conversation about, extraterrestrial civilizations. We were constantly talking about as children in the 70s and through the 80s. So I had watched SETI, you might want to say, come into formation. And I talk about it in my article that I sort of critique SETI, but I critique it like I would critique someone I really care about, because I have a lot of admiration for SETI and SETI work. And I even put in the article, I think when you look at professional organizations around the country and you look at what they have to achieve, both in terms of not only academic work, but working with the sort of popular culture front, Jill Tarter has been amazing and done a lot of good work. So let me just jump right now. There's going to be a couple moments when I read. So one of our working group members happened to be actually in the room in Berkeley. And then the three of us, Sonia, Kim, and I, were Skyping in. And so Willie Lempert is right there among the members of Breakthrough Listen. And about 80% of the way through our working group presentation, the Skype technology has a glitch. So I want us to pause for a moment and just consider the meta-discursive aspects, that there's a group of people who are allegedly specialists at technology, aiming to communicate with us about the ethics of communication using technology. And during this conversation, the technology has a glitch. So the three of us who were Skyping in, we lost all sound and video. And we thought we were totally disconnected from that room in Berkeley. But in Berkeley, the Breakthrough Listen people could still see and hear us, even though they could see that we couldn't see and hear them based on their monitors. And Willie was in the room to verify that. So they quickly realized that we on Skype could not see or hear them. And so therefore we thought we were no longer being viewed or recorded. And we started having a conversation amongst the three of us about how weird the meeting is. And it doesn't seem to be going very well. And I don't think that one guy in the back there has even paid attention once. We thought we were in a private conversation. So thus the people in Berkeley began to see and hear what we thought was a private conversation on our end, and Lempert, being present and concerned about the ethics of overhearing what was clearly intended to be private, asked that the feed be cut, or at least that they mute it in the room to respect our privacy. And the response of the Breakthrough Listen team was, no, it's fine, leave it on. After all, since we were talking about the conference and the people in attendance, it seemed relevant to the topic at hand. That's a pretty weird, you might want to say, kismetic moment where we have in front of us, literally playing itself out, a very serious problem with the ethics of who's listening and the decision one makes to listen or hear what others are communicating. So we have then a group of people working under the title of Breakthrough Listen, who are, from their own self-representation, on an intensive scientific search using, quote, the most powerful communication devices around the globe. And when they were presented with the option to act ethically with incredibly basic personal computer, audio, video technology, they made the decision that they should listen in, project onto a screen, and record what other humans thought were a private conversation. You will hear this, you might want to say, as an argument coming from people who are, you might want to say, SETI defenders, which is what harm could come from only listening. But see, listening is part of a series of actions, and you might want to say a series of ethical decisions. Listening, watching, surveying, penetrating, extracting, studying, owning. These series of actions rise, you might want to say, very triggered emotions in Indigenous people. Really, any of us who understand the history of colonialism, who have seen it play out in various ways, in ways that duplicate right now the Mars mission, or the way that rovers go through what is allegedly lifeless spaces and survey and extract and begin the testing process. So we had a lot to say, you might want to say, on the ethics of research. And that's really where it came down to in the bottom of the meeting, was a type of shock. A type of shock because a lot of us in Native Studies had been spending decades doing institutional review board applications, showing that our work would not cause more harm than it does good in the world, or in many cases, not do any harm at all. Being held up on our research for months, while people that we assume are mostly medical or biological scientists, but STEM nonetheless, were making a decision about whether our research could go ahead and go forward on whether it was on ethical grounds. And here we're having a conversation with people who are primarily trained in STEM, and as Denning told me, not primarily, 100%, making a decision to listen out there in the universe without ever having crafted an actual statement of ethics, with no actual mission statement that lays forward any sort of research protocol and how one will handle oneself, not only at contact, but the ethics of attempting to contact. That is something that for many of us who work in Native communities have played out in South America, in Central America, in Southern Brazil, in parts of Peru, when people have said that tribe wants to assert the right to not be contacted. Is that a right? It is a right. Is it a right that we recognize? And Kim and I started doing some work on this before we became the special issue editors, on what seemed to be the relationship between very well-intentional people, the people who decide that they're going to go into fields to study rocks in space, chemical compositions of exoplanets, maybe a lot of terms that I don't understand. Frankly, if I go through the membership list of your website, I don't know what a lot of you do. They're really big words. It sounds really incredible. And when someone makes a decision to do that kind of work in the world, I want to support you. But there's something about the, you might want to say, liberal notion that we can all be what we want when we grow up, that has led good people, well-intended people, to do research that then falls into very capitalist and military purposes. And I say that as the son of a man who spent his life as an engineer working on technology that was then sold to the military complex. We know legally that there's a right to profit from any resource extraction that takes place in space. When the US Spurring Private Aerospace Competitiveness and Entrepreneurship Act of 2015 was passed, which permits US citizens to, quote, engage in the commercial exploration of space resources, we, inside the history of sciences, saw something that we had seen in the 16th century. We had seen an aligning of national interests that coincide with capitalism and imperialism. And that was really, you might want to say, a moment after that working group experience that I started to think more deeply about lining up those histories. The history of colonialism as it's been understood by others, and also the history of space exploration as it looked according to one organization, as loosely defined as it is, called SETI. And that's the reason for the existence of the piece that a few of you have read today. Now, I don't want to go.
David, I just want to make sure, you asked if you were sharing screen. I want to make sure.
Nope, that hasn't begun yet.
Great, just making sure.
Thank you. So it actually is timely that you say that. So one of the things that lining up looked like was, you might want to say, a very, very basic sort of like, whoa, as I'm reading about this work in SETI and reading their websites and reading some of the articles and reading Carl Sagan and thinking about some of the terms that are being used. And this falls right along the lines with some of my other work, focus on terms and the words and the power they have and what they imply. So it's kind of in my wheelhouse to just take some words and say, well, let's look exactly and unpack what this word means. So I was sort of looking, you might want to say, at the word intelligence, which many of you have already looked critically at. And also the idea of advanced civilization. And I'm not going to sit here and say I created this really fancy slideshow for you for this talk, because I actually think there's a pedagogical reason to tell you the truth, which is I literally just took this from my undergraduate class that I teach, in which I cover the history of sciences. And that's one of those things where you might want to say it coincides with the essay and it enables me to talk a little bit about the essay without having to actually read it to you or do any sort of formal reading or presentation today. The work of Arthur Lovejoy is really important to me as a graduate student. One of my advisors, James Clifford, had written extensively about contact cultures and the way that we talk about other people in the world. Another one of my advisors, Donna Haraway, looked at the history of science and looked at the implications of race, class, gender, sex, ability, all that stuff, as it pertains to how science has laid itself out for us. And then a third advisor who passed while I was a graduate student, Robert Burkhofer, wrote the book, The White Man's Indian, which was really about the idea that everything that we've called an Indian is really a projection of ourselves. And I saw that as lining up with Enrique Dussels' work, who wrote The Invention of the Americas. And that's where the essay, you might want to say, sits, the one that was inside the journal. I really focus it on Dussel in a way I'm not going to talk much about today. There's a lot in the journal article I'm not going to talk about today, just so I could save the majority of our time for a space where I learned from you. But in the class I teach on alien psychics, ghosts, on the class that I teach on colonialism and resistance, on the class I teach on indigenous film, I use these charts of the Great Chain of Being, which comes from Arthur Lovejoy, and which I talk about as being a really important thing to keep in mind, which is that when we talk about how people had developed notions of science, even the creation of what we call the contemporary university, it was born out of a historic moment that was deeply overlapping with theology. And theological and philosophical hypotheses were one of those things that went hand in hand for a very long period of time. And I guess it was really important when reading Arthur Lovejoy that you recognize this is not a blip, this is not a moment. It was not just a few great thinkers. It was what we would call, in some ways, the founders of Enlightenment thinking. And that they were working under this ideology called the Great Chain of Being, which of course they would not have perhaps called it then. Arthur Lovejoy calls it that. He actually does find some references where it was called the Great Chain of Being, at which humans hold the center point, and that there are certain parts, you might want to say, of the world that we're in charge of. And this, you might want to see, is laid out in, if any of you know your Bible studies, there's two versions of Genesis within Genesis, and there's one in which we are part of animals, and there's another one in which we're in charge of animals. It sort of kicks in after the first part, that all of a sudden we start naming them and we're in control of them. So one of the ideas here inside the Great Chain of Being is that everything has a place, an order of things, which has been played off, of course, by Foucault and Bruno Latour. The idea that that order of things comes handed to us. And in that order of things, not only is there a hierarchy, and I do mean that word in a vertical sense, but everything has a place in that order, and everything has a place even within the subset. So just even within humans, there's something called royalty, and there's an order there. And even within families, there's an order there, the father, the mother, the kids, that sort of thing. And so you would see this Great Chain of Being really laying the groundwork for what became taxonomic thinking, which was sort of carried forward by Linnaeus and Darwin. The idea here is that if you actually do have any sort of theories about what exists in the world, including things like devil, that one of the big arguments you might want to say would be, where do they fit? Where do they fall up in this line? Because we know this line to be true. Not only does grace fall downward, pulling from my religious studies training, but sort of power is actually upward. And that which has more power is above and has less power is below. And you might want to say power here. I don't mean in the sort of general Foucauldian sense. I mean literally the ability to act on one's will and intention, ability to do stuff. And humans are really in this middle spot, as anyone in this room can totally recognize who were brought up in religious education, because we are both human, but we also have this soul. Poor dogs, they don't get souls, but we actually have this middle ground, and this notion that we are part material and part spiritual plays itself out in a lot of various religious denominations differently. A lot of, you might want to say, my paranormal studies stuff is really invested in the Great Chain of Being, because it's so fascinating to see how scientifical thinking, which is people who pretend to be scientists, use scientific words. So it's like the search for Bigfoot, ancient aliens, all that stuff that's on popular culture and TV. You in some ways are seeing them play out the Great Chain of Being, which is, where does this belong? It used to be human. It used to be some sort of combination between animals and humans, and then evolution came, and now this being is still living out there. And one of the things I really point out to my students, just I offer this as a side comment, is that in the 17th and 18th century, we often think about aliens as being this invention from 1950 with the Betty Barney Hill story and the creation of the modern alien myth coming from Whitley Strieber and a lot of other abduction claims. Actually, aliens were generally perceived to be in existence hundreds of years ago, 17th century, 18th century. Arthur Lovejoy actually literally says, inside the Great Chain of Being, one of the questions that came up for a lot of philosophers is not if there were aliens, it's just simply where they were at in the Great Chain of Being. Were they more powerful than humans or less? The sort of deciding factor was how close they were to the sun. It was sort of assumed that if you were closer to the sun, you were more intelligent. So I don't know if you're going to see it really clearly, but what I do in the article then is I add the line, that's the horizontal line of the axis, the time or the temporality to the notion of high vertical space. So if power is greater at its most utmost part, then you can see how progress is something that we're trying to achieve. And this has played itself out as in people who study historiography, the writing of history, have said multiple times. And here I'm talking about not only my graduate professor Hayden White, but also Descartes was a key figure in this, who really made the idea that we as a civilization are getting better, we're progressing. And I'm going to start threading in now why all this matters. This idea of progression is in some ways synonymous with the idea of advanced civilization. The notion that we are becoming you might want to say more civilized as a society. I become a bit rhetorical in the essay and make claims about how we don't seem to be doing that. We've been in continuous wars nonstop for over 30 years. We have world hunger off the charts still. The notion of what's taking place even most recently with the exact same people who have put their tip into space and now own Twitter. There's a lot of questions about whether we're actually becoming more civilized at all. Now, one could make the argument that we're becoming more technologically advanced, which you might want to say is something that I would love to learn from you in a bit, and I'm going to just reserve it as the third and last part of my talk. So we're going to put a pin in that, and are going to come back to that. So in this Great Chain of Being, we really see the notion that history has been written many times with a type of narrative in which a hero has to sort of win against the odds. And this has played itself out, obviously, in the 16th, early 16th, all the way to the 18th century. Some can say it plays out now with the way that people talk about others on this planet, which is going to be the groundwork. You might want to say the analogy for where I'm going here with the work that you do when you think about life on other planets. We already have a history of talking about people and expecting to see people who look like us. And if they don't, the ramifications have been, to say the word serious would be an understatement. They've meant life or death. So in the very first woodcuts, here's one from 1505. Here's one from the eastern seaboard of the United States, the current day of the United States from 1505. The woodcuts, as Robert Burkhofer shows in The White Man's Indian, were drawn by people who had spent less than 10 hours inside a community. And so they had a very limited view to make incredibly, you might want to say, consequential commentary about the people of the New World that they were contacting. And one of the things that we really saw is, the nudity, the lack of clothing, the cannibalism, which was a lack of civility. You have a sense that these are violent people. These are all things that the Europeans did not want to see about themselves. These are all, you might want to say, moments of difference. And these moments of difference have had implications that we are still living in today in the structural inequality that leads there to be less Native people in the sciences. And to make that claim is not just simply rhetorical. It's simply looking at the way people have been living inside societies or civilizations that really derive from these key moments of culture contact. And when we talk about SETI, I think we're talking about people who are in the forefront of the contact zones. They're literally, you would imagine, the people who would be the most intelligent about the history of contact. And yet they're mostly STEM trained. And if it's at anything like UCLA, I can tell you that the students who are in STEM at UCLA have maybe a class in colonialism, maybe a class in ethnic studies in which some of this stuff would be covered. When we define people by what we think they should be, according to where we are at, that is not only essentialist, it's also a projecting or a covering over rather than a discovering. And that's why I work on the theoretical contributions of Enrique Dussel inside my essay. So I guess in some ways, I want to just simply end here by saying, you can sort of look at this and say, wow, we've come so far. This is ridiculous in some ways to think that, we haven't the intelligence or the ability to overcome some of these really, malintent describers or writers, slave traders from the 16th century. If you Google Indian right now, you're still going to see feathers. You're still going to see people who are wearing face paint, tend to be without clothes. You don't see Wall Street workers. You don't see investment bankers when you type in Native American. And there's a reason why, which is because there's deep repercussions structurally and societally when we have these culture contact moments and have them defined in such a way that they play themselves out according to difference and similarity with us. And us here being a term that I use as a settler. But in this case, for a very rare moment in my professional career, I mean humans on the planet Earth. Us on Earth are doing exactly what they did in the 16th century. And so I thought that was worth writing up. Now, for the last part of my talk, I simply want to go to the essay. And I do assume that some people have read it, so hopefully can push me further here. And I want to be really clear that the argument I'm making about SETI not being incredibly diverse in the people who populate that loosely defined organization. The exact claim that Danine said, nope, you're actually being too nice. It's 100%. So when I see some outreach taking place on the SETI website for SETI talks, SETI artists, diversifying in a sort of corporate sense, the membership, that's all great. It's also very recent compared to the history of SETI, but that's great. And I just simply want to say the exact same critique can be said of me. And I want to be really clear about that. I have no training in astrobiology. I've not taken a physics class in my life. I could tell you very little about the debate about Pluto, much less most of what, when I read the descriptions of people who are SETI, what they're specialists in. So I'm not sitting here and saying bad, 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 bad. I'm saying this is in some ways, I don't want to say nature because I believe in Bruno Latour, there's nothing natural here. The culture that we've created is that the training that we have created, the educational system that we've been a part of has led us to be inside a cultural context. I'm trying to remove malintent from this or people with bad hearts. has created a culture context where the people at the forefront of contacting and listening for other life perhaps could themselves as an organization and as a society, as a network, as an affiliation, bring in more people, but also more approaches that have been developed over a very long time in the various sciences, arts, and humanities. And then additionally, you might want to say a more structural change I'm calling for is for us to recognize that Indigenous people have been actually making science. They have knowledge-making practices. They have incredibly deep and advanced, you might want to say, ways of understanding the land that we're currently living in and what counts as life and intelligence. But it's going to require a meta-paradigm shift in the Thomas Kuhnian sense of what we even consider reality and how we define truth. So in some ways, I want to indigenize what counts as science, but in other ways, I also want to ask those who do work loosely defined as SETI or SETI in small case letters, to bring more people to the table, which, by the way, I think this symposium is doing. So, and that sounded really egotistical by me, but I've also looked at the history of people you've brought here and the sort of conversations you've fostered. So kudos to you. So I'm going to go to page 32 of the article before I open this up for conversation. Defining the search for intelligent life is reminiscent of another aspect of the great chain of being. One that is very important in my courses on colonialism. And that is that if we draw that horizontal axis halfway down the vertical line, the great chain of being is transformed into a graph. And the horizontal axis demarcates humans in the chain, and its length can be understood as time itself, adding a temporal dimension. We often are perceived as slowly becoming more civilized over time, and that in this view, we are moving forward from prehistoric times, and we are evidencing over time progress, industriousness. We are traveling toward what seems to be an elusive state of perfection, where the vertical and horizontal axis intersects could be seen as now, the present. To adopt a view that extraterrestrials are somehow more advanced than Earthlings simply duplicates an older version of the noble savage paradox, leading to further dangerous misconceptions and projections. To put others on a collective civilizational stance on some pedestal for their lack of capitalist infection flips the notion that another is more or less worthy of coeval relating. Even if some scientists presume that ETs might be more intelligent, as Sagan regularly hypothesized, the absence of ETs from visitable and viewable spaces has led to the prospecting and scientific experimentation we now see taking place among the International Space Station and others, Mars expeditions, the Jeff Bezos, the Elon Musks of the world. We should keep in mind that one prime argument for the colonization of land has always been that the land hasn't been used correctly or been used at all. This, we see it played out not only in the United States, you see it in arguments in Israel, you see it in arguments in Brazil. The notion that someone else doesn't know how to use the land or isn't using the land at all, so therefore we have a right to use it the right way. And I just want to say that's a sort of viewing, it's an optical illusion of what land is supposed to, or space is supposed to look like from a civilizational perspective. So I'm going to end there because I think it lays itself out fairly clearly. And also, I don't want to be too pedantic here and say that these are some of my initial thoughts, but I also am, and I think Jason knows this from our email conversations, I'm also very interested, before I talk to 2 other astrobiology symposiums in the next year, I'm also interested in learning where I've missed the mark in terms of recent, I'm literally grabbing a pen to take notes today, to take notes on where I've missed the mark on the previous people or previous moments in SETI where this conversation hasn't laid itself out the way that I've thought it has, or other ways that SETI practitioners, to use that, is that word the right word? SETI practitioners are in fact thinking very complexly about what counts as advancement, what counts as civilization, and what counts as life, and lastly, what counts as intelligence. So what was that? Oh, that was like 35 minutes. All right.
That was fantastic. Thank you.
Thanks, Jason.
People gather their thoughts. I'll maybe I'll open things up by trying to address those. It'll be a little scattered, and certainly not in, trying to defend SETI in the past before I even got involved, but just to answer your questions of where these questions have come up. I know that Sagan was, I don't know if ambivalent's the right word, maybe nuanced on a lot of these. He pointed out the problems with starting Hermes on the 500th anniversary of Columbus's landing in the New World, that maybe that was not the best date to choose and not the most appropriate metaphor. In general, I thought, he was trying to be thoughtful, and he always tried to incorporate, when he wrote papers on human expansion across the globe as a metaphor or an analogy, or as a model for expansion through the galaxy, he was reading the anthropology. He was trying to actually engage. The Billingham report, John Billingham put together a workshop when Hermes started, or when the SETI program started, that was largely people outside of the sciences, sociologists, anthropologists, to try and understand, what NASA needed to do in terms of post-detection. And I think the emphasis was supposed to be post-detection, but I would say that is the area where there's decades of contact with the humanities and the social sciences. And so it's funny to hear that you said, Catherine said that, it's 100% STEM training in SETI, because I would count her as a member of the SETI community.
Right, that's true, right?
Absolutely. And she is, been involved for a long time and is a force in the field and has been very influential, especially, for me, certainly. And so I think it might mean, who is in the room when you're developing experiments? Who's in the room when you're taking the radio waves from space and converting them? And there the list is much smaller. Claire Webb, as you mentioned, in residence at Breakthrough Listen. Clément, who's on the call now, is in residence at Breakthrough Listen, and his training is outside of STEM, in philosophy, I believe. And so those are my scattered, suggestion, answers to that part. And then to get to intelligence and advanced and stuff, I think part of the challenge here is that there isn't a canon. Like, you can't go to the textbook and look up what these words mean.
It's true.
In terms of jargon, right? Like, if you want to know what redshift means in a particular context, you can look it up in a it might be different in different parts of astronomy. And so that's something we're trying to do here. And so I'm hopeful that the people with formal training in the field that have taken my class would be, if you were to talk to them, my hope is that they would be immediately able to say, yes, this is what we mean by advanced. And so my answer is always the functional one. It's like Jill Tarter's functional definition of intelligence. If we were to notice them, it's because they're doing something we can notice, which necessarily means it's loud or really bright, that there's a lot of photons, that there's something to detect. And that involves losing a lot of energy. And so for me, the analogy I always like is, it's like if you're looking for animals and you aren't very good at it, you're only going to notice the big ones, like maybe only megafauna, right? Elephants. Maybe that's the only thing big enough for you to see out your window far away. And so you might hypothesize that evolution would produce large animals that you could detect. And you might say why evolution might create such things. You might be tempted to say evolution is directed towards large things, and that those are bigger and better and forward, and those are the biggest ones you'll detect. But a more accurate thing is that evolution is stochastic. It fills all the available niches. Some of those will be big, not most of them, and that's not an end state. It's not a goal. But some will be big, and those are the ones you'll find. And so I agree, advanced in a literal sense is wrong, but in the sense that some will grow and be big for whatever reasons, and those are the ones we'll find. Anyway, that's how I justify using those terms. But I've taken up a huge amount of space with hands up.
No, I think that's very useful, actually. Thank you. I have some responses, but I'd love to hear what Macy has to say.
Okay. If they're quick, maybe we should respond and then.
I can. What's very interesting to me is that I just looked at this Zachary, thank you so much. You know, it took me, this is what I do in Alien Psychics and Ghosts. Like people, all these students come in to take this class because they're going to learn about the truth of alien psychics and ghosts. And then they're probably pretty bummed to find out, actually, we're going to use alien psychics and ghosts to think through what's it mean if they are real, not that they are real, right? So let's actually think about extraterrestrials and blow up every conception that we can that's a human projection of them, that they have arms, that there's even a head on top of a body, like that sort of stuff. And my new partner is a Star Trekkie, and I'm not. So we're going through a lot of Trek history as I'm learning that Star Trek may have covered all of this like 30 years ago, and I didn't know. So I'll literally give him an assignment. I'm like, can you show me where extraterrestrials don't have a body? And he's like, oh, episode 32 of season where they're an energy form. I'm like, awesome. Show me where they're really like colonial. And he's like, the Borg turns like, and he'll just like go into like these things. What I've learned is that maybe when you say things like, we are noticing them because they did something very loud and very bright. I can't help but think in my studies of healing across culture where energetic chakra healing, which has existed for 3,600 years, whereas the X-rays existed for like 170. So just to say, there's been a long history of people doing chakra hit, no matter what you think of it. It's absolutely quiet and minute. It's not big at all. It's the finer, I'm going to use really new agey terms. It's the finer frequency. I don't know what I mean. I don't even know what I'm saying because I'm not really one of those people. But when I study it by the language they use and allegedly what they're doing, they're grounding this in a science that is very, 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 you might want to say modest, quiet. They're using a whole different amount of terminology. And what if that is, I gotta sound so new age. What if that's the metaparadigm, which is that we shouldn't be looking for big, energetic expulsion or events that took place and tracing their techno signatures, or I'm using words that I'm borrowing from you that I should not use. But what if we're looking for these things when in fact, we need to look for the gnats and the smaller than mosquitoes, the fleas and the ticks of the world, not the stegosaurus, that sort of thing.
No, absolutely. And I say we look for the big stuff because at these distances, it's only the loud stuff we can detect. But it'd be interesting to explore how that finer scale might be something we could detect. And we by no means mean it's not there or it's not advanced, just that if we can't find it, it feels a little academic. All right, I'm going to go to Macy. I also do actually have a 1 o'clock, so Macy's going to take over the meeting.
Yeah, you guys kind of did talk a lot about what I was going to say, but I kind of wanted to talk about how you mentioned like Carl Sagan and others talking about like assuming other alien life is like very intelligent or advanced or whatever. And kind of like what Jason was saying is that like, I think for a lot of us, like we think there's like such a broad spectrum of what could exist out there, but what we are likely to be able to detect would be those with very powerful technology. Right. So it's not that we think all alien life it would be more advanced than us. It's like things that we would be able to find would have to have big technology at this point in time.
Yeah, I think that's a really important position because as Denning was expressing it to me, she was sort of like saying, listen, David, it's just scientifically speaking, it's not that that's what we're looking for because we want it. That's just the most likely. It's the most likely possibility. Okay.
If I could just jump in, I'm sorry, just because I'm going to have to leave in a minute too. Adam Frank from University of Rochester. It's also the point that when you talk, because I really get your point about, thank you for this talk. It was awesome. And I just want to say, when I read your paper, when Jason introduced me to the paper last year, the series of articles, it blew me away. They were really, I was reading also at the same time, The Dawn of Everything by Graeber and Wenberg. And the two just were, absolutely paradigm shifting for me. So thank you. They were great. The whole series were great. But I just wanted to, I'm sorry to step in because I'm going to have to leave. When you talk about the gnats, right? The problem is the most powerful technologies that we can imagine the aliens to have, we're going to detect them as gnats, right? That, those are the ones we are just barely, if we have the best absolute detecting technology, we're going to be able, it's going to be absolutely marginal for us to see. So it's not like when we talk about these really loud things, they're really loud where they are, but for us, that is the absolute limit of our ability to detect it. So we're not going to be able to detect the subtler stuff, not now at least.
But you just used a phrase that is really key, based on our technology. You literally just said the word, based on our technology.
Right.
Our technology is human technology made by humans for the design of developing a way of measuring and finding things. We are not good at non-things.
Right.
And that's really, you might want to say, where I start this class. I start the class, which is, give me your best argument against UFOs. And 70 people start giving me their best arguments against those. They're all based on space travel. Every single one of them is based on space travel, literally traversing space, because it's the only thing we can think of. We can't think of things that aren't based in space and time, because those are two orienting coordinates as humans. And I want to get them to a point where I think, well, what is a metaparadigm shift? What is a way in which it literally just blows apart even what we think of is taking place when we're looking at an objective reality? So if you say that your technology, and I don't know your tech, this is where I'm at my dumbest. I don't know your technology. I don't know what you're measuring. I don't even know how you came up with the ability to know it exists. My guess, it started with theoretical physics, and now it's inside astrobiological terms. But however you're doing it, I guarantee you it was made by humans to find things that humans think exist. And so you've sort of failed the first test of Ray Bradbury's or Star Trek's notion, which is that you've projected yourself as the basis of what will count as a thing, as not just life and not just intelligence, but even a thing.
Well, so this gets to a really, and I see why you're interested in this in the in the healing arts as well.
Oh, it happens across the board there, yeah.
Right. So what do you do about things that you can't detect via your machines, right? You want to say, and this guy, because one of the things I thought that was interesting with the idea of settler science versus, say, indigenous science. So if part of indigenous science is, say, the spirit of ancestors, right? How do you have, this is always, when science is at its best or at its most ideal, it's a means of having public knowledge that, you can do something and show that it's true. I can do something that it shows that it's true. And then we can both look at it, objective, that's what objective means, not some, purely objective God's eye view of the world. And so the question is, when you're talking between cultures, how do you do that? Because ancestral, the awareness of the ancestors, is something that if I can't build a machine to do it, if I just relies on meditative techniques or something, it's not clear how to necessarily make that public knowledge cross-culturally. Whereas the machine things, look, if I turn on a light and the light blinds you, you're like, whoa, I was just blinded. We can all agree that we're blinded.
Right, yeah. Well, that is what I think the next project would be. It would be, rather than using a rhetorical device like settler science, actually slowing down and saying, well, what are the implications of even making that claim? What is a settler science? My indication at this point is the relationship is object orientated. And so what I do is I look at what the scientific method is, how it works, and what it's good for. And it's good for a lot, and it's wonderful. And I love x-rays, and I love antibiotics. I take way more antibiotics than any human should take. I love the inventions that science has made possible. But that being said, I think it's a bit racist and culturally biased to say that the 3,000 to 6,000 years of notions of chakras and energies in the body, that's dumb and doesn't make sense. That's a little bit loaded with a lot of racial implications, that what white people do and what European, ancestry has provided us is real intelligence, and everything else is folklore.
Right.
That's the problem for me. Now, you're right, though. The way forward is much more challenging than some sort of rhetorical political statement like that. The way forward would actually be doing the work. And so this is what I see, is I see inside my first book, Native people have been making maps. They just haven't been physical. They've been mapping. They've been doing cartography. They've been incredibly very smart about land and land usage. They just don't leave a record of it. They don't have an object that's ready there waiting for you. March 21st was found to be the best day for planting in the valley of Phoenix, Arizona, through a rock in a hole and another hole in a rock 5 miles away. That's not a telescope. That's the land and humans working together. By the way, that exact same thing still exists. Their irrigation system is still the one Phoenix uses, and that was going on at the time of Christ. So do you understand what I'm saying? Like, so what was taking place there was a type of knowledge making.
Yes.
And it was practical, and it served them, and it was engaged with their environment in the same way that SETI scientists are. But I just simply think that they were using different tools and they had a different end result in mind. And I think
Absolutely.
we're
I
invested.
agree.
We're invested in sharing. I should also say, in the tribe that I work with, their definition of knowledge, this is really interesting. When I asked them to define knowledge, they said it's the social performance of truth. So you're right. And actually, the National Science Foundation has this inside the requirements for who they're going to fund. Is it knowledge that then can spread? Is it translocal? Does it move out of one particular case study and enable us to apply it to others? And I think that that still is important. And the reason I say this is because that's part of actually the Indigenous tribe that I worked with for 23 years. So.
All right, well, thank you very much, Macy. I'm so sorry to interrupt. I just had to go to class. So I'm going to, as I walk to class, I'm going to keep listening, but Macy, I apologize for interrupting. Thank you again.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, Dan. Dan Mills?
I was just touching my head. Okay. I think Zach had their hand up first.
Oh, okay. I don't see that screen. Oh, there it is.
Hi.
Hi, Zach.
Unless Macy is done, I think she should finish what she was.
Oh, yeah.
No, I was done.
Okay. Let's see. One bit of background on the idea on SETI's relationship with technology. I forget which it was, but one of the early proponents of SETI, back around 1960. Made the point that if there was, we had that with the technology of Western society, that was the first point at which it would be possible for us to send a message to a society with similar technology around, on a planet around another star.
Oh.
So part of the definite. So I mean, certainly there's a lot of baggage around the use of the word advanced to describe this, but part of the idea of SETI is, we have reached the point where, if there's someone with a similar technology base, that was intentionally trying to communicate with us, we might actually be able to detect it.
Right.
But if we do the same thing,
Right.
now, the ethics of looking for directed signals versus unintended chatter, that I think that does actually raise a really good point, and I think that was discussed in a previous seminar. But
Really,
I can't remember.
because that's the part that came out. That part that you're on right now, the ethics part. I don't know about the first part. I find it very interesting, but the second part is the part that Breakthrough Listen and us had this very strange, you might want to say, disagreement, which is that, is there something settler? That sounds so weird. Let me phrase it the other way. Is there something indigenous about not really bothering your neighbors? Is there something about just letting people be in the world and not having to be like, hey, neighbor, we're here on Earth? And people being like, okay, fine, mind your business. Like, why are you saying hi? Now, we know that's a false dichotomy. Native people were engaging other Native people before Europeans ever showed up. There were notions of, neighbors, shared land use. I'm not saying we all need to stay inside our own partitioned existence and not reach out to say hi to someone. I'm just simply saying, has there been any statement ever that we are not intentionally looking to eavesdrop? And that's the wrong word, but we don't intend to eavesdrop. Is there anywhere ever the statement that we're intentionally looking for the messages that were intentionally sent to be heard? Or is it, we're just listening?
other people will be able to speak on that far more authoritatively than I will. I will note that it would be far easier to receive a message that was intentionally meant for us to receive than to receive much less be able to make sense of, communications that were not intentionally sent to us.
Okay.
Now, whether any other life any other life or technology is interested in doing that is a whole nother set of questions. But just looking, as an engineer and science enthusiast, at what is easiest thing to receive is something intentionally meant to be received.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. I guess in some ways I associate this as an analogy to being in a hotel room and hearing someone in the room next to you. Like, the technology is the glass you grab and you put it to the wall. And to grab that technology is an ethical decision versus you can't help but hearing them. They're just super loud. Now, why are they super loud? Because they don't really care about you. Like, or they want you to hear them, which is a whole other weird sexual thing. But the notion that the whole idea that they might want us to know they exist is you might want to say the ethical question. What if they don't? Everyone that I've ever talked to, SETI-related, was like, well, if they don't, we wouldn't. Why? Because that assumes they'd be smarter than us. That assumes they'd have technology. There's so much assumption based in your work. It's so that it's easy to critique. And I'm saying that it's super easy to critique you because there's so many assumptions, because there has to be, because you're in the theoretical realm in so many ways. So this isn't an attack. I'm literally being obvious about the fact that I would love for there to be an ethical statement about what SETI is, either small case SETI or uppercase SETI. I would love that. That would change so much.
Okay.
I would like to comment on some of those things. So yeah, something you mentioned is like differentiating between like trying to find intentional messages versus eavesdropping. And I know eavesdropping is a major SETI strategy, and
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's something that's very popular. And I know one of the reasons for that is that like, kind of thinking about it backwards here on Earth, like we're not sending out all kinds of intentional messages. So maybe it would be easier to find us through eavesdropping, right? So some people kind of look at that the other way. Well, maybe other life out there has the same kind of way of living about that. So yeah, even the word eavesdropping, you'll hear all the time in SETI. It's a very popular idea.
I did not know that at all. I love it. I love knowing it. I don't love that it exists, but I love knowing it.
And then I wanted to comment on something you said earlier too, something that Zachary was talking about. So basically, like kind of the first SETI paper in 1959 basically was kind of like justifying that like SETI would be worthwhile because our current radio telescopes would be capable of detecting radio transmissions that we humans could create from the distance of another star. And then a couple years later, a very similar paper came out demonstrating the same thing with lasers. So kind of the motivations, especially initial motivations for starting SETI, were very based on what exactly technology we had created and were using regularly.
Yeah, I love that. So when you say the first SETI paper in 1959, could you give me a little more on how to find that?
Yeah,
okay.
Maybe I'll just email you a link.
That would be great. shorter@ucla.edu. Yeah, I've really struggled in the last 7 years when SETI people refer to papers, the SETI journal, like, and then it ends up being like, I can't find it. And then there's so much that exists in rumor in the world of SETI. But anyway, Dan, you've been so patient.
Yeah, I was just curious. The entire motivation of SETI is already like the question of, are we alone? Like, is that an open question? Like, presumably we are alone for all we know in this, but to other non-Western cultures, isn't that not an open question to begin with? Isn't the entire starting point like, oh, we're obviously not alone. You're just not paying attention to all the intelligence that's bombarding us, you know?
Yeah, Dan, that's why I flashed really quickly this Nobel Prize that just went to theoretical physics work in entanglement. So Mary Strathern, Nuret Bird David, an Israeli scholar, they have gone some distance to show that it's not just simply the English language which has made it so, but we generally think of ourselves as individuals, and that's not a shared cross-cultural thing. There are cultures that think of themselves as individuals. They are a division of something larger and greater. And so literally their noun, first person, is a we. It's not a first person I, it's a first person we. Now, of course, they can change that if they want linguistically. So there's a lot of work that I don't need to go into here, but my point being is that your question is so on the mark for the way I want to start thinking about. So listen, most of you in this room are probably way over on the SETI side than you are on the ufologist side of the other groups that I'm in conversation with, and that's fine. But I can tell you 100% that they are in agreement that contact has happened. They are here. And, and I was told by Claire Webb, do not say a word about that if you're going to talk to anyone at SETI. Like, just don't bring it up. Like that. Don't even refer to it. Like if you're going to have any traction with them. So to me, it's really fascinating when I think he left the room. But anyway, like the idea that like when we were doing this message signaling, we had telescopes that had a certain capability. And we were sort of like out there saying like, okay, here's us sending a signal or hopefully receiving a signal through all these other means. And now I can't stop thinking of Jodie Foster. But anyway, we're going to receive this signal and then it's going to be communication. But communication may already be taking place. Like there was European contact where a European stepped foot on land. There were years and years of boats going by. And you know what I'm saying? Like contact is not a moment. A border is not a line. It's a zone. And I think we're in that zone. I won't say contact happened. My father would disagree. My father literally thought UFOs had come. And he was an engineer for the government. But he wasn't thinking that people had been abducted or anyone got out of them. He was thinking more like drones, sort of like some sort of unmanned technology, because they just simply flew too fast, did hard right angles at high speeds. And his notion was, what he knew from his position, there was no government that could make that technology. That's not a human technology, but also no being could exist inside that machine moving at that angle. So are we in the zone? Yeah, I'll say we're in the zone, which means that our telescopes look kind of funny to them because we think it's taking place in this sort of radio frequency. Is that what it's called? The radio frequency spectrum, like some sort of spectrum of energetic communication that enables us to project messages and also receive them that are intended for us. Thank you, Zachary. I'm trying to follow the thread as well. So my sense of it is that the Bracewell probe, my sense of it is that we're trying using technology to communicate that is not the right technology. But I can't go much further than that because that's your field. I don't know what the technology is. So, Macy, do you have another contribution?
No, I forgot to lower my hand. Sorry.
Okay. This is fascinating, Zachary. Thank you. I didn't know about the Bracewell probe at all. I never heard of it. Clement?
Yes, thank you very much for your many insights. I want to maybe to go back to the question you asked about the definition of advancement.
Yeah.
And I indeed think it's very much understudied and under-analyzed. I agree with you on that. And yeah, the reason is that it's an extremely difficult question. And basically what modern evolutionary theory did is to destroy this idea of the grand chain of being, that it's actually much more complicated, much more dynamic, much more stochastic, as Jason was saying, so that it's not a predefined plan of organisms that develop higher and higher body plans, etc. But still, so in evolutionary theory, there is a distinction between evolutionary progress, and the direction of evolution. So the notion of progress is very much value laden. So there is this idea that it's better than the previous, that new species or more advanced species have made progress because they are better than others.
Right.
But the notion of direction is much softer, and it says basically that I don't know, an organism that has more ways to adapt will be fitter and will tend to dominate the population. And so that's the direction that evolutionary organisms will tend to be more adaptive in general. And maybe, yes, an analogy that I used in one paper is to compare, to consider the following situation. You have a mountain, which is a kind of fractal landscape, and there is rain pouring on the mountain. So can you predict the path of every raindrop on the mountain? Nobody can do that. It's totally unpredictable. But can you predict that the rain will tend to fall down and form lakes of all sides and so on? Yes, you can. So you can predict the general direction in your fitness landscape if you say that this mountain is your landscape. But it doesn't mean that you can predict everything.
Right.
There's still a lot of uncertainty. And yes, I think in general in the field, it's an unexamined assumption that there is such a thing as a direction, if not progress or development. Right. But the thing is that it's a tremendously important question and tremendously difficult question.
Oh, absolutely. I guess I want to sort of emphasize, not only to my students, but anyone, these are tough stuff. What we're trying to think through is really hard because we're using human language to talk about human concepts, but think beyond the human. How do you think beyond the human when your mouth is human and your brain is human? Like, this is really tough stuff. As a side comment, I know this will probably upset you. In my interviews with mediums and psychics, you just said the way that they describe their work. You don't know all the little things that happen. You just know how it's going to end up. And they're literally like, will say like, well, that's life, is that you make choices, all these stuff. You just have all these massive things that sort of, they're going to happen. And that's the world they work on. Your initial contribution, though, is kind of really flying in my head right now. And I can't stop thinking about how important this is, because as I was a graduate student, I was really, 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 as you all know, very heady. You're in your head all the time. You're wrestling with some big stuff. Now, the only way that I found I could help that was I was in meditation every Wednesday night. So I was surrounded by a bunch of Buddhists. I wasn't Buddhist, but I was surrounded by a bunch of Buddhists doing meditation in Santa Cruz, California on Wednesday nights. And one of the people who ran it was the person who ghost wrote the book, The Tibetan Book of Living and Dying. So so there was a lot of meditation about death. And we just constantly had to keep saying to ourselves, like, as part of a meditation, which is not great when you're 29 and you're just trying to surf and enjoy life, you're dying. Every breath is a breath toward death. And now that I'm 50 something, I'm degrading. Your body's degrading. Everyone in this room, your body's degrading. It is just how it works. Your cells are not duplicating more so, they're duplicating less so. Maybe what we're doing, just to go I love this. I love conversations like this. Let's go really wide with this. Maybe what we're doing, maybe the human condition is developing notions like progress, improvement, and advancement, because we are really wrestling with the fact that we're actually not going to get better. I'm not going to run a marathon in 3 years, no matter how many days I work with a personal trainer this week.
I think it's a great point, and it has been made actually with the notion of immortality. And there is this book which is called Immortality. I will post it in the chat.
Okay.
And the author argues that actually the core driver of civilization is actually the fear of death or the will to immortality, which is the
Milan Kundera wrote a whole book called Immortality, kind of about that from a fictional standpoint. Now, what I love doing is I love taking people on your side of the spectrum, the SETI side, and just having you consider what one contribution might be from the far crazy side of those people who are abductees. If you look at the abduction reports, they generally say they're here to get something from us before we die off. There's a preponderance of abductee alleged messages, or the point of the whole contact was, we're not going to be around for a super long time. And they're trying to get something from us genetically, resource-wise, intelligence-wise. That really, this is literally like, what are some of the mental gymnastics that any human might do to not recognize that aliens exist? Well, a big one is, we're not going to be around, and they know that. We're a tadpole in their pond in the backyard, and they see what's happening to us. So I'm not saying that's true. I'm not saying contact has begun, all that stuff. I'm just simply saying where these things line up as being somewhat useful to think through, or as Donna would say, we need to articulate these two things together without caring about their veracity. Let's just articulate and see where they get us. Where they get us is a recognition that perhaps a lot of the intention and motivation we have to believing we're advanced and to caring about advancement is because, in fact, we can't get over this thing we have about being advanced and civilized, when in fact we're neither. I'm not saying we're not. I'm not saying we're not advanced in some ways, right? But that's the whole point. I mean, my dad said, and this is him doing UFO research, and he thought deeply about this and was in conversation with black level security, people in the government. Their notion was that an alien, if they existed, would be somewhat on the spectrum, incredibly brilliant in some ways, probably doesn't understand rhythm, like probably wouldn't understand what we're looking at when we look at a Picasso or a Matisse. Like, that's probably not in their skill set. So what's more advanced, right?
Yes, well, you have this problem also in just in biology, and like, who is more advanced, a shark or a hawk or a leopard or a lion? They are in totally different environments. So they may be top predators in the water, in the air, and on land.
Right.
But it doesn't make sense. The hawk is never going to fight with a
a shark will never find a lion, right?
So yes. So what some evolutionary theorists say is that instead of having the great chain of being, where you can have a total order, it's a total order where you can say which you can put a position on each species in a line. We have actually the partial order. So if you look on in the sea, yes, ecologists know that sharks and orcas are top predators. So yeah, it might be useful to think of SETI in this way too.
Well, I guess I don't want to sort of go in the direction that we have to start thinking about the aliens among us, or what it would ever be like to be in a room with a person from a being. I didn't mean person, but person in the grammatical category, a being, person. I see, I'm struggling. I don't want to go in that direction. I'm just saying that if we're looking for signs of life, then our understanding of what technology would be necessary, and the technology they're using, the concepts of why they would want to be heard in the first place, the ethics of saying, like, I'm going to be really upfront here about what I don't know. Do we have messages flying around the universe that we're allegedly sending out from humans? Like, there's always rumors, but I never know if it's just sort of like ufology rumor.
There's been a few.
Yeah, right? We've done this, right?
Not a lot.
We've essentially created a thing that's our message, and we've sent it out somehow.
Yeah, that has happened. Yeah.
Yes,
okay.
like maybe a half dozen times.
A half a dozen times, right? Who wrote those? No, literally, like, what was their training?
Well, at least for one of them, they were astronomers.
Really? Right?
Yeah.
Okay, so to me, that's a really clear moment right there where we say, okay, hey, gang, and I mean all of you, could we get more people in the room next time we do one of those? Like, because I'd like to talk to them about our race relations, and maybe, or like, I'd like to just sort of like say we're really still stuck on binary sexuality. We're so ancient in some ways, and I'd love for them to know just where we're at, and I don't think we're being represented fairly.
This is something people talk about a lot, actually.
Okay.
I know SETI and METI we kind of think of as different concepts, because like a lot of us who do SETI are not involved in sending messages at all. Like I've never been involved in anything like that, and I don't want to.
It's a
because I
whole
can't-
subdivision of SETI?
Yeah,
It's like a
I
whole-
know that I can't represent humanity. I would not
Oh.
feel comfortable trying to. But
Yeah, I wouldn't mind being involved in the messaging. Like, I'm not against your endeavor by any way. Like, I'm not really a proponent that you're all eavesdropping, and that's a horrible thing. I'm a big proponent of why I love this thing that someone sent in the link. Why is the universe seem so quiet? Well, I actually don't think it is. I don't think we hear on all the spectrums and frequencies that are being used, or channels, and I don't mean that in the new age world. I think that we probably aren't. I think space has a sound, right? And whether we're on that frequency is just like a radio, just that's about. And I think like the old audiograms, which helped people hear, and they would sort of test hearing. We probably test here and here and here and here, but not any of those middle areas. So yeah,
that's a good point.
Yeah, Clement, that was exactly Sonia Atley, who specializes in research ethics. That was exactly her point, was that you would go so much further as an organization. And I don't even, like, they even know this critique. Like, right? Like SETI knows that they should have an ethical statement somewhere, but they don't. It's not that hard. I mean, no, there's actually mission statements are super hard, but you could do one.
I know of at least one person who has thought about the ethics of SETI, who is Chelsea Haramia. I don't know if you've ever spoken to her.
No, but heard the name. I think
Yeah.
Rebecca, do you know Rebecca Charbonneau?
Yeah.
Yeah, Rebecca has mentioned the name. So
yeah. If we're gonna end at 1:30, I have office hours at 1:30, so I'm gonna have to go. But I wanted to mention before we wrap up, I'm not sure if you've talked to Jason much about this, but we have a SETI conference here happening this summer. And we would love for you to come.
I
We can
didn't know
email
that.
more about that later.
You're Philadelphia. You're
We're in State College, Pennsylvania.
No, I know, but I'm just trying to think. I'm saying that because I have to go through Philadelphia. What month is it?
It's in June.
Oh, late June?
Like the
Could work.
19th to 22nd.
Could work. We're on the quarter system here. And so we go all the way till June 14th. It's hard for me to do stuff before June 14th. I didn't know that. Have Jason or someone send me a notice about it. Yeah, I really did actually mean this. I have to talk at 2 astrobiology symposiums in the next year because of this fucking article. Oh, excuse me, stupid article. So I loved writing it, but I'm nervous as hell around people like you because I couldn't tell you what a radio frequency. I literally don't know how the microwave works in my kitchen. And now I'm talking to people who work in that world about, I mean, this is the whole point. Let's all be good at what we do, but then come to the table. And that's the thing I've loved about the entertainment industry is makeup doesn't try to do costume and costume doesn't try to do, everyone do the thing that you're really good at and you're trained at, but be a part of the making of something much different. Yeah, I really appreciate the engagement. I love thinking through this stuff. And if your symposium is anything like the last 40 minutes, I would be really into it. So
yeah,
but
we
if
try to incorporate.
But if it's 3 days about
more.
radio frequencies and electromagnetic spectrums, I'm not going to be really fun.
There will be some of both.
Okay. Maybe I'll finally understand it though. That would be better for me. So all right. Well, convey my thanks to Jason. Thank you to everyone here. And yeah, maybe we'll see you in June. And if not, in the future. Take care.
All right.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone. Thank you.
Bye.